I'm back again combining the great looks of this plastic model kit with functional RC electronics. The Make It RC CT-C01 chassis has once again proven to be a great base for this project, but there were certainly a few challenges along the way and some effort required to make everything look and drive as good as possible. From start to finish, I'll be covering all of that and more in today's video, as I do my best to replicate the awesome Mack DM800 in 1/25th scale. Let's bring this rig to life. Hello everyone and welcome! I'm back again with another big rig build. Well, even in the world of RC, this is actually kind of a little big rig as it's only 1/25th scale, but you know what I mean. I really want to start today's video off by giving a huge thank you to all of our great customers and Patreon supporters for all of the interest and feedback on our CT-C01 platform. A fully 3D printable RC chassis designed specifically for these larger semi-truck and commercial truck plastic model to RC conversions, this is a platform I've showcased numerous times in prior videos, including when I built that 1977 GMC General. Quite a bit of effort went into making this platform as affordable, adjustable, and easy to 3D print and assemble as possible, and now it's time to reap the rewards. Of course, like many of you, I'm always building and tinkering, and today I'm excited to showcase not only a new truck build, but also some new parts I've designed and have made available to all of you builders out there. It certainly took some time, but all in all, I'm very happy with how this Mack DM800 turned out in the end, and I'm super excited to finally be able to showcase this build in today's video, as well as try to share as much useful information as I can from my experience building this truck. I definitely have some things on my mind with regards to this project, and a bit of wisdom that I think would be helpful to anyone doing a similar build. Like with many of these plastic model to RC conversions, nothing is ever entirely routine or without some custom work and problem solving being required, especially if you really want to make your vehicle look as accurate as possible. While overall the process of building this Mack was pretty simple and straightforward, there were a few challenges along the way and maybe some things I would consider doing differently in the future. But hey, you gotta have some challenges in there to make things interesting. But by giving you a detailed overview of this project, hopefully I can pass on some ideas and provide some inspiration to those of you watching, or if nothing else, something to have on in the background while you're wrenching on your own project. Just an all-around awesome rig top to bottom, so from the unboxing to the very first test drive, let's dive right in and get started. As I've mentioned before, I once again have to be honest when I say I'm a little out of my wheelhouse here with these larger commercial trucks. Like anyone else, a lot of times I'll pick the subject of a project based on prior interest in that specific vehicle, but for this particular project, seeing this plastic model kit on the shelf at my local hobby shop was my introduction to the Mack DM800. It was probably about the cheapest 1/25th scale truck kit that they had, and hey, the CT-C01 is supposed to be a versatile platform that can be used with just about any one of these big rigs in the scale, so let's put that to the test with this project today and hope everything fits like a glove. This particular kit would present a number of challenges throughout the duration of this project, but more on that as we progress. Aside from the aforementioned lower cost and having some cool vintage looking box art with a nice patriotic paint job, I really wasn't sure what to expect from this kit, though from the very beginning I was interested in building more of a heavy haul, sort of off-road capable truck, like something you'd see on a construction site or hauling logs down a dirt road. That GMC General that I built previously is more akin to something that you'd see cruising down the highway, so naturally I wanted something a little different with this project, and it seemed like this Mack would fit the bill. The DM800 specifically was produced from the mid-60s to the late 80s, designed for heavy hauling over rougher terrain, making them especially suitable for use in construction, mining, and logging operations. Today, while some of these trucks are still in regular use, they're also desirable for collectors and vintage truck enthusiasts. A variety of different engines were offered over the years, including this turbocharged V8 diesel replicated in this particular kit by MPC, which was first issued in 1971 and has since been reissued a few times over the decades, with the newest reissue here from 2018. These kits are readily available from a variety of retailers. It appears that very little has changed with this kit over the decades, from the parts included to the box art. I was hoping this old school kit wouldn't prove to be too difficult to put together. Opinions with regards to the quality and fitment seem to be a bit mixed. I'll share more of my thoughts along the way, but this certainly isn't a kit I would necessarily recommend for a beginner, or if you really want to have everything lined up absolutely perfectly, as you're going to have to do a bit of fighting to get everything precisely positioned. First impressions as I got this kit unboxed were quite good, as everything seemed to be nicely molded and this model kit also smelled great. One of the absolute awesome things about building vehicles in this scale is that there's no shortage of variety when it comes to the options that are available, whether you're talking about cars, light trucks, or commercial vehicles like this. You'll see far more variety in the vehicles available in the model kit section of your local hobby shop than you will in the RC vehicle section. Well, at least specifically when we're talking about vehicles that replicate real-world cars and trucks. And of course, if the plethora of store-bought kits provided by manufacturers still isn't enough for you, it's relatively easy to 3D print your own, as there's no shortage of 3D print files available, and once you've made that initial investment into a 3D printing setup, it's not that difficult or expensive to produce your own. As awesome as some of the larger scale semi-trucks are, such as those offered by Tamiya, I really like that there's way more older trucks from the 1970s and earlier represented in these smaller scale plastic model kits. Personally, I just think the older trucks look a lot cooler than some of the more modern designs, but that's just my opinion. One thing you will notice as we have a look at all of the parts that are included is that there is a lot of chrome. You could really make yourself a shiny truck with all of these parts, but that's not at all the look that I'm going for, so a lot of these parts will get primed and painted. It's probably ideal to go ahead and strip off that chrome plating. There are a number of different products that you can use to accomplish that, including just regular old household bleach, but generally I don't really worry about the chrome and usually just scuff it up, prime it, and paint it. Having a look through the instructions, they could certainly be a little vague at times, as I noticed throughout the assembly process. Things could have been made more clear. However, like with most things in life, a little bit of critical thinking and problem-solving skills can get you far, and eventually I was able to get everything put together as intended. With a kit like this, when you finally get this rig successfully put together, you really feel like you earned it. Something I thought was kind of interesting is it includes a steerable front axle with the knuckles able to pivot. The axle included in this kit will go unused for this project, but I just thought it was kind of a cool and interesting feature, especially when you want to do a model to RC conversion. Unlike some of the more highly detailed on-road projects I've showcased in the past on this channel, all of the parts for the frame, suspension, and drivetrain included in this model kit will not be used for this project. However, I did want to go ahead and assemble the frame to get an idea of how long I want my CTC01 chassis to be, and get an idea of how the cab and the front end is supposed to go together. With such a long overhang in the front, I assumed the easiest solution would be to simply chop off the very front of the frame and graft it onto the CTC01. You'll notice that the cab doesn't sit centered on the frame, which I guess is a little bit unusual, so obviously I had to factor that in when getting everything lined up and mounted to the RC chassis. But as you can see, the frame included in the model kit is fairly similar in dimensions to the CTC01, just as I would hope. With a little bit of custom work, everything should fit together nicely. Now, something I was curious about is whether or not the tires included in this kit would fit the wheel design that I created previously, which are a perfect fit for the semi-tires offered by AMT. However, these tires here are a little too large, so I'll have to factor that in when creating some compatible wheels. The tires are a somewhat soft rubber-like material. In a perfect world, I wish they were a lot softer, like the tires designed for RC vehicles, so they'd actually flex when driving over bumps, but at least they're not rock hard. As I showcased in a recent video with that 1/24 scale Jeep J10, switching to a softer tire compound really made a huge difference with that vehicle, and there are a number of different options available for tires in that size. Fortunately, not really as big of a deal here with the Semi, as it's not going to be going over terrain as rough as this. They are soft enough that I had no problem slipping them over the wheels that I 3D printed. I didn't end up using any of the decals included in this kit, but you get a nice selection to choose from. I could certainly see these coming in handy for a future project. As cool as it would be to replicate the patriotic paint scheme on the box art, I ended up going with something a little more mundane and easy to create with just a single paint color for the entire cab. I guess to sum it up, this is a decades-old plastic model kit, much like that AMT GMC General model that I put together previously. As was my experience with that project, not exactly the best fitting or easiest model to put together, But if you put in the effort, you can get a great looking result in the end, but some skill and patience will certainly be required to get everything to go together as intended, which seems to often be the case with these kits based around decades old tooling. Now I'm wanting this truck to have sort of a worn and weathered appearance, so it's not like everything has to be perfect anyways in order to achieve this desired appearance. But with the model kit unboxed, having a look at all of the parts, and beginning to brainstorm how this thing is going to go together, let's go ahead and switch our attention to the functional RC chassis. The CTC01 chassis will be a familiar sight to those who have been following this channel for a while, with it not only being the base for my prior big rig build, but the entire development of this platform has been covered in a series of videos, which I'll have linked below in the description if you'd like to check them out. In consideration for those who have seen those prior videos and are already familiar with this platform, I'll keep the overview brief here, but if you are interested in learning more or are in the process of doing a build utilizing this chassis, I highly recommend that you check out some of the links below in the description for more information. To summarize though, this chassis was designed to be relatively basic, adjustable, durable, inexpensive, easy to 3D print, and easy to assemble, creating a functional base for these types of big rig and commercial truck plastic model to RC conversions. I, as have many customers and Patreon supporters, have been very pleased with this platform so far, that we have gotten a ton of comments and messages from people wanting to see a more detailed drivetrain and suspension design on a chassis like this, just as we've done for some of our other chassis designs. Believe me, I hear you, especially with the more off-road heavy haul theme I'm going for with this project. A much more detailed and flexible suspension design would be very cool to have. I do really like just how simple and versatile the CTC01 is in its current form, but that said, and as many predicted, I've been diving down the big rig rabbit hole more and more, getting inspired by all of the great kits available on the market, as well as seeing what others in the hobby are building. I've been thoroughly enjoying the RC construction series over on RC Everyday's channel, as he's building scale trails using only RC construction equipment, and of course you need plenty of big rigs to haul everything around, so that's been a very fun process to watch, especially when I'm working on a vehicle like this. I definitely recommend going and checking out his videos. I'll put a link below in the description if you want to go check it out. Lots of awesome stuff over there on the RC Everyday channel. Now those are larger 1/14th scale models from Tamiya, and one of the things cool about those is that they have a much more detailed drivetrain and suspension layout, something a lot closer to what would be seen on the real thing, and again would be cool to incorporate into these smaller scale chassis designs for these plastic model to RC conversions. But at least for now, if you're interested in a highly detailed semi-truck chassis, those kits from Tamiya are definitely a great option. Just be prepared to spend a whole lot more. But if you're curious about a price for a project like this, you could certainly build something similar to what I have here for around 200 bucks, give or take. The highest cost items that I have here would be the plastic model kit, which was somewhere around $40 US, and the CTC01 chassis kit, which is around 40 bucks as well, though of course less expensive if you're 3D printing your own parts. Then there are many different choices, both more and less expensive when it comes to transmitters, but I'm using a Radiolink RC6GS, just as I've used for many projects prior, which seems to be going for around 80 bucks right now. Of course, keep in mind that just like with many transmitters, the RC6GS allows you to store settings for multiple different models, so you can use the same transmitter for multiple vehicles. You don't have to keep buying a transmitter for every vehicle that you build. As you'll see a little later, I have this paired to a R4 FGM receiver. Those go for a little under 20 bucks, and I really like their small size for projects like this. Not the smallest receiver out there, however I think it's probably one of the smallest LAN receivers that Radiolink makes, and it'll be well suited for a vehicle of this size. And then both the 3S LiPo battery and 3S LiPo compatible ESC I'm using are under 15 a piece, so hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of the price. That's at least all the major stuff before you just start diving into a sheet of styrene, some paint, glue, nuts and bolts, power to run the Dremel. If you want that detailed of a breakdown, I can't give it to you, but like I said, a good ballpark is about 200 bucks. Now, especially when comparing to how expensive other RC projects can get, especially the really scale builds, these little plastic model to RC conversions are definitely more on the budget end of the spectrum, which is nice. But do keep in mind, just because these projects aren't particularly expensive, doesn't mean these are necessarily easy to build, don't take much time, or are ideal for beginners. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. Now, if you're new to this hobby and are particularly interested in this specific niche, that's great, and I have showcased a number of builds with beginners in mind. But if you're choosing to get into this niche just because custom building a chassis for a plastic model is cheaper than buying a nice Tamiya kit or a ready-to-run RC 4-wheel drive trail truck, just make sure you've got the necessary tools and knowledge to ensure you'll have success with a project like this. I'm obviously a huge fan of all the stuff we design and sell, but also I'm well aware that these types of projects might not appeal to the more casual or beginner hobbyist, and therefore there are many other great options on the market to consider. Some prior RC and model building experience is a great prerequisite, though this CTC01 really isn't that challenging to put together as long as you're okay with some smaller size hardware. I won't be diving into the details here as I already have a separate assembly tutorial video, which again I'll be linking below in the description. If you'd like to get a better idea of the assembly process, I would highly recommend you go check out that video. There is quite a bit of adjustability when it comes to increasing the wheelbase and positioning the electronics and body mounts. This flexibility is helpful for these types of projects, allowing compatibility with a variety of different cabs. And of course, if you're getting into this niche of the RC hobby, a little scratch building with some styrene definitely comes in handy, or even firing up the CAD software and designing some custom parts if you really want to get fancy. Now, something a little lacking in terms of variety at the time of building this truck were the wheel options. This wheel here that you see on this GMC General looks nice on this rig and is similar to what you'd see on a lot of real-world trucks, but I wanted a different design more similar to what you see here for this Mack. So I fired up Autodesk Fusion and, using some reference images, did my best to replicate the look of this wheel here. In the end, I think these turned out looking really nice, though I think it's worth mentioning that I did have to make a few minor sacrifices to the accuracy of this wheel in order to ensure there's a sufficient amount of strength for when it's time to stretch those rubber-like tires from the model kit onto these wheels. Also, I had to make sure that the front wheels are compatible with the bearings and hardware that secure them to the RC chassis. This wheel design here, along with an additional one that I created, though I've yet to use on any project, have been added to our Patreon page and online store, so whether you'd like to 3D print your own or purchase a set from us, you're good to go. Do note, however, that the particular wheels that I'm using for this truck are a bit larger in order to fit the tires included in this particular model kit. I'm not really sure how many other tires they might fit. This slightly larger size is also available, so just make sure you choose these wheels if you'd like to use this exact model kit with these exact tires that are included. Otherwise, the other designs are the exact same dimensions as the wheel design that I made originally, so they'll fit the same AMT Big Rig tires, which are available as a standalone product or included in some of their model kits. But with the CTC01 chassis complete and these new wheels created, it's time to modify the plastic model kit to fit, so let's get started with that. Alright, so we got a nice chassis as our foundation, but now it's time to make this thing look like a Mack DM800. This is one part of the project that I sort of envy you as the viewer, because I've condensed many hours of fiddling around with all these parts and trying to get everything lined up as nice as possible, down into a, well, what I'd like to think is at least a tolerable YouTube video. As model builders, we like to make these vehicles look as much like the real thing as possible, but of course this is often much easier said than done. If it's any comfort though, pretty much everything I'm doing from this point on is just decoration if you think about it. As long as I'm not interfering with the functionality of the RC chassis below, I'm basically just putting the icing on the cake. Of course, I do still have to install the remaining electronics and ensure I have a spot to place the battery, but the size of the electronics I've chosen for this project relative to the size of this model means that I won't have to sweat that process too much, as there's sufficient room underneath the cab. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself though. A lot of custom work is involved, as you'll soon see, including some modifications to this frame that was included in the model kit. It's funny, as you may recall in a prior video during the development of the CTC01, I went to some effort to ensure that the very front of the chassis wouldn't extend too far beyond the front wheels, trying to ensure that there will never be an issue with there being too much overhang on the front. But as you can see, there's clearly not going to be an issue with that here, as there's like a mile of front end sticking out beyond the wheels on this DM800. Hey, I guess if you want to push the front axle forward and put on some much larger wheels, that won't be an issue here, but to replicate how the real truck looks, I thought it would be best to simply cut the front of the frame off that's included with the kit, and then glue it to the front of the CTC01, and everything on the front, including the pivoting fenders, can simply be installed just as instructed in the manual. This turned out in hindsight to be a good way to do it, though of course there's a few things to keep in mind. I first needed to do a little measuring, mostly by eyeball, to determine how much of the stock frame I wanted to extend beyond the front of the CTC01. Not really a critical measurement, but I did want to make sure I was cutting each side of the frame to the exact same length, so the frame rails are parallel with the RC chassis. In addition to having these pieces be the correct length, I also needed them to be at the correct height to line up with the cab. I didn't want the distance between the top of the fenders and the wheels to be too large or too small. I could have maybe had the cab sitting a little lower on the finished truck, but as you'll see in the end, I got everything lined up fairly well. As mentioned before, something that makes things a little more interesting here is that the cab doesn't actually sit centered on the frame. It's offset towards the left side, so that's something I had to keep in mind when getting everything lined up. Also, just the overall fitment of the fenders, engine cover pieces, and the cab really didn't seem all that great. I spent a lot of time in the early stages of this project just trying to get all these parts up front to not only fit together, but line up and look halfway decent. Certainly not one of those kits that just falls right into place, but as always I did the best I could with a little bit of trimming and sanding in some spots where I thought it might help align things better. If you want to save yourself some trouble, you could just glue the hood and the fenders to the rest of the cab, but if you want these components to be able to open like the real thing, you're going to have to get everything mounted individually and lined up with one another. Eventually, after chopping off the front of the frame and gluing it to the RC chassis, I determined the position and height that the cab would need to be sitting. Note how I positioned each one of these magnetic body mounts to work with this off-center cab. Just like with the GMC General previously, 4mm rare earth magnets will be used to secure the cab in place, while still allowing it to be easily removable when needed. Another thing to ensure the chassis will remain serviceable is I made sure to only glue this front section of the frame onto this individual piece here. That way everything up front can still be taken apart when needed. I didn't want to accidentally glue all of these individual pieces of the CTC01 together and make them so they can't be separated. Really, the best advice I can give is to take your time and do lots of mock-ups, maybe remove a little bit of material where needed, and try to get everything to fit together as good as possible. Honestly, for how much time I spent trying to get everything lined up, the panel gaps on the finished model are not exactly stellar, but it is what it is. When you get one of these trucks put together and looking good, you really feel like you accomplished something. You've got the challenge of building a model kit with tooling from 50 years ago, plus the whole RC conversion process. I'm sure I spent a lot more time brainstorming ideas and mocking things up than I did actually executing whatever plan I came up with. With these types of builds, there's a lot of just sitting and staring at the project at the workbench until you figure out what looks good and what's the best way to do something. This is jumping back in time a little as I want to now focus more on the work that I did to the plastic model kit rather than the process of getting it mounted to the RC chassis. Like with basically any other model build, after locating all of the parts and removing them from the tree, I did any necessary sanding and trimming to remove any imperfections left over from the manufacturing process. Overall, a lot of nicely molded parts. There's definitely some flash and imperfections in some spots as you'd expect, and a lot of the holes ended up needing to be enlarged slightly to at least try and get things to fit a little better. Getting this rig put together is sort of a mixture of following along with the instructions included in the model, but also deviating when necessary to make everything work with this RC chassis. This isn't going to be a simple, linear, follow-along step-by-step 1-2-3 experience. You really have to pay attention to what's ahead, make alterations to allow these parts to fit, and sometimes you do have to go back and make some changes. This is the part where you really start to flex your skills as a model builder. But with the cab coming together nicely, there was finally a bit of a reprieve when putting together the interior, which required absolutely no modifications for this custom RC project. I definitely needed to increase the size of some of the holes that the levers and pedals go into on the floor, but that was nothing new with this kit at this point. This model does include parts for an optional roof-mounted air conditioner, though I decided to leave that off for this build. I'm going for a full Spartan work truck here, but at least there is a heater. I got everything assembled as far as I wanted to go at this stage. I'll wait to glue everything together until after these parts have been painted. Back over to the cab, I got everything installed that I wanted to prior to the painting process, as well as test fit any items that I'll be installing later on, like the windows. On the roof, I decided to deviate from the instructions and install the horns more towards the center of the cab, just a personal preference as I didn't think the horns looked as good sort of hanging off the side and blocking some of the roof lights. I thought this arrangement here would look a little better. Because of this, I did need to drill a couple additional holes in this new location and fill the prior 2 holes, as well as the 2 additional holes that are going unused since I'm not installing the air conditioning. Not a big deal, I just used a little bit of modeling putty to fill those in, followed by some sanding to smooth it out. Piece by piece, I went through the instructions and located all of the parts that I'll be using, some of which I'll be gluing into place now, others I'll only test fit as they'll be painted separately and glued on later. Staying on theme with this project, plenty of sanding and trimming was required to get everything to fit together as intended, and even then some of the fitment here isn't exactly perfect, but it's not like it needs to be. Not something I show, but I would definitely recommend using a respirator when you're sanding all of this plastic. I can't imagine all those tiny microplastic particles is particularly healthy. Thanks especially to those custom 3D printed wheels, the CTC01 chassis is really taking shape. But at this point I wanted to add some of the parts included in the plastic model kit to help improve the lifelike appearance even more, things like the fuel tanks and battery boxes. This bracket here that sits behind the cab required some modifications to fit around the slightly larger CTC01 frame, but with a little bit of trimming, it'll work great. After getting these parts washed and applying a little bit of primer and paint to some of these pieces, I could begin making any necessary modifications where needed to fit around the RC chassis. This fuel tank here is a good example of a part that looks okay, but if you really wanted to make it look even better, you could take some extra time to sand the transition between these 2 pieces and add a little bit of filler to help make this look like one seamless piece rather than 2 halves glued together. I was already well aware at this stage that this rig wasn't exactly going to be flawless, so not really a concern for me personally, but if you want to go that extra distance, you'll get an even better looking result in the end. Sometimes though, at a certain point, you gotta say it's good enough. I was playing around a little bit with some of the parts included in the CTC01 kit, and as always brainstorming how exactly I wanted to mount the cab and secure everything to the frame. Some rare earth magnets glued to the underside of the interior will be perfect for securing the cab to the frame. I just needed to make sure the cab is sitting at the correct height to try and line it up as best as possible with the fenders. In addition to the 2 mounts on the frame rails, I also added a 3rd set of magnets to prevent the cab from pivoting front to back and provide a little extra holding strength. There's really no science to this, just get the cab positioned where you want, glue the magnets in place, and as always, try to make things as serviceable as possible in case you need to work on this truck at some point in the future. Again, as I've said, I was really trying to get everything on the front of this truck lined up as good as possible, but as you'll see in the end, it's not exactly perfect, but I mean, at least I tried. As you may have noticed, I did slap a little bit more filler onto those holes and sanded that smooth. It's not like this area really needs to be perfect, as worst case scenario, it looks like there's a few dents up there, which would be fine on a vehicle like this. I went ahead and got the fuel tanks, battery boxes, and everything else that's getting mounted to the chassis glued into place. Just like on the real truck, this entire chassis is going to be sprayed the same color, so basically everything I wanted painted matte black was installed. No chrome fuel tanks or anything like that, nothing fancy, just a rugged work truck. I needed to modify the driver's side fuel tank a bit in order to fit around the body mount, but overall a pretty simple process. The biggest thing was just making sure that I mounted these in a way that wouldn't block screws or impede the serviceability of this chassis, well, at least not impede it too much. It is a model after all, but I still like to at least try and make things somewhat easy to work on, but sometimes scale realism can kind of challenge that notion. What I did here with the battery boxes, at least I'm pretty sure that's what these are, is I simply removed one of the lower screws here that helps keep the electronics mounts in place. That way it's easy to remove that piece if needed. There's still 6 other screws holding that electronics mount in place, so I don't have to worry about it falling off. But this is really starting to look like a real truck now. A little rough, sure, but just wait until I get everything painted and weathered. Before I do that though, there was still one final part that I wanted to add to the chassis. You know how I was talking about brainstorming and always thinking ahead? Well, having a look at the electronics and the room that I'm working with here, I came to the conclusion that it would be nice to have a spot just behind the cab to place the battery, allowing it to be easily removable without requiring the cab to be removed. If you saw that prior build I did with the GMC General, you'll recall how the sleeper compartment on that truck was a great spot to store the battery. Just pop off the top and there's easy access with plenty of room. There's no sleeper here, but that doesn't mean I can't be a bit creative and come up with something similar. After looking at some reference images online, I decided to create a sort of cab guard / storage compartment that wouldn't look out of place on a real truck like this, so that way I won't ruin the lifelike appearance of this rig while still allowing easy access to the 3S LiPo battery so it can be changed. The process of creating this piece was quite simple, especially thanks to some high-tech toys I have access to in the form of this Moose 3D scanner from 3D Maker Pro. I have a full standalone video reviewing this scanner if you'd like to check that out, but these scanners have certainly come in handy for a variety of different projects. Not at all a tool that's required for a build like this, but if you've got one, it can certainly come in handy. What I did was scan the truck with the cab in place, and then line that 3D scan up with the editable model of the CTC01 chassis. Once that was done, I could design the cab guard in a way that I think looks good with the cab, and ensures that it won't be getting in the way of any other parts of the vehicle. Obviously not the most comprehensive or highest detail scan, as I didn't spend that much time capturing this data, and the black chassis is not that easy to capture, but I didn't need it to be that detailed, I just needed a general shape. It's important to understand that 3D scanners, especially in this price range, are not magical duplicator machines that will perfectly capture every detail with 100% accuracy and precision. But if you're just wanting something to reference like I'm doing here, it can really help. I can ensure that these parts that I'm designing will work, and therefore reduce the amount of time spent modeling them, and eliminate any waste that could be produced by having to reprint a part that's not fitting or looking how I want. Of course, a part like this could also be scratch built. Whether you're doing some good old-fashioned scratch building or doing some high-tech designing and 3D printing, as long as you get there in the end, that's what matters. I got these parts 3D printed using a Creality K1 with a 0.4 size nozzle, and despite the resolution not being quite as high with a nozzle of that size, I was really pleased with how these parts turned out. I was a little nervous that the diamond plating was going to be too small to 3D print, but overall it looks great. I had to strike a balance of not making that detail so small that it wouldn't show up, but also not too large to where it looks out of scale. I glued in a few magnets to keep this removable piece in place while driving. There's a version 2 of this that uses 4mm rare earth magnets on the two corners rather than the 2mm that I have here, as I found the holding power to be insufficient with just those two smaller magnets. Just an FYI if you want to 3D print this cab guard that I have here. STL files of course can be found on our Patreon. I'd recommend trying out the version 2 as I think that will hold the cover on a lot better, but I guess you can also just go ahead and glue in some additional magnets on the other end like I did here, whatever works to ensure it stays secure. Of course, naturally, there was some undesirable texture and imperfections as a result of the 3D printing process, but a few coats of some high-build automotive primer really helped smooth everything out, and as you'll see, this ended up looking great on the finished truck. At this point, it's finally time to get everything painted. As with most projects, I simply used some regular spray cans from the hardware store, nothing really special, but since I wanted a somewhat non-uniform weathered appearance on both the body and chassis, I laid down several different colors, not worrying about any spots that might be uneven. Later you'll see me sand down some of those layers of paint to reveal sections of silver and brown to look like rust and steel. A very simple weathering technique, but it can be quite effective when done properly. I also applied some chrome and silver paint to some of the chrome parts as the paint is less shiny and reflective than the chrome plating from the model kit, which I think looks just a little bit better, especially on something like this that I want to have a weathered appearance. Later, I'll also be applying a black wash to help dull down those chrome parts. For now though, here's a look at all of the parts after painting. I had some Caterpillar yellow left over from another project, so I thought that would look pretty good on this Mack. That paint still needs some time to dry though before I do any sanding, so I got to work on the interior. I used a couple of pastels to grime up all of the parts, especially the floor, and I also hand painted a few details before gluing everything into place. Sort of a no-frills interior that won't be that visible on the finished truck, but it's complete and looking good for what it is, so I'll go ahead and move on to the wheels. Those 3D printed wheels looked a lot better after a coat of matte black paint, and I added a little extra detail in the form of a white ring going around the outer edge. I'll be installing them along with all of the electronics onto the chassis now. Check out our post on Patreon for a complete rundown of all the electronics used, but as you can see, everything is relatively small in size to make it easier to fit onto the CTC01 chassis. These are all the same electronics that I used prior on that GMC General, except for the transmitter and receiver, which as I mentioned earlier, is a Radiolink RC6GS and R4FGM. I also decided to upgrade to a metal gear steering servo since I plan to do some off-road driving, although of course it's very mild off-roading. Whether or not it's necessary, I'm not really sure, but I just figured I'd install something a little stronger, especially as these servos aren't that expensive. The standard plastic ones though are fine, especially for driving over smoother surfaces. The design of this particular servo is slightly different than the plastic ones that we offer, so the screw hole doesn't line up precisely, but I just forced the screw in and it's solidly secured into place, no worries there. I did my best to keep all of the wires as tidy as possible. That 3S LiPo battery is kind of a tight squeeze in there, and as you can see, I did need to remove some material from the front of that cab guard in order for the battery to sit slightly more forward, but this modification won't be visible anywhere on the exterior of the truck. After getting the motors and wheels installed, it was time to power on this truck for the first time and make sure it worked. Perfect. As always, make sure that you adjust any settings as necessary, including setting up endpoints for the steering or simply reducing the dual rate to ensure you're not trying to force the steering servo or steering linkage beyond its physical limits. I still have some small LEDs that I'll be adding for the headlights and taillights, but aside from that, all of the electronics are in and everything's working just as it should. This chassis is also looking pretty good after that coat of matte black paint. After giving that paint on the cab plenty of time to dry, it's finally time to do some weathering. All I did was simply do a bit of sanding in some spots to reveal the layers of paint below, almost instantly giving these panels a much more aged and grimy appearance. Of course, having plenty of reference material certainly helps with this process, taking inspiration from how these real trucks look. I definitely don't want to go over the top and make this thing look too rough, just a bit of wear and tear, nothing too crazy. So far so good. From here I did some further painting by hand, and I also used a silver Sharpie to add some additional details. After that I began gluing all of these additional pieces into place, making sure to use a clear drying glue for parts like the windows. I like to try not to go too heavy with the glue, but you really have to keep in mind this is a functional vehicle that's going to be driven over uneven surfaces, and I'd really like to make things as solid as possible so none of these tiny parts fall off while driving. Some of these chrome parts, like the emblems and the handles that go on the hood, I didn't end up painting, but what I did do was scuff them up a bit with a Scotch-Brite pad. I think it kind of helped dull them down a bit. I just don't want these chrome pieces to be too shiny. I figured now would be a good time to go ahead and get the headlights installed. This can sometimes be a bit of a pain to do, however it ended up being quite an easy process here at this Mack. I went with these 1.8mm size LEDs for this project, rather than the Pico LEDs that I've used prior. These obviously take up a little bit more space, but honestly, their slightly larger size I think makes them a little easier to work with and get glued into place. I needed to drill a couple of holes just large enough for the round part of the LED to stick through on these chrome pieces, and then some larger holes behind them in the fenders for the rest of the LED. Once that was done though, everything could simply be glued into place as normal, and especially with the warm tint of these particular LEDs, I think they look really nice. No LEDs for the marker lights or turn signals, though maybe someday I'll try to make those functional, but these tiny parts are already a little tricky to glue into place even without the LEDs involved. Next I went ahead and glued the Mack letters onto the grille. This was a little tedious as I think they were supposed to be glued in from the back, but I didn't find them to be a great fit, so what I did was just sand each one of them down so they're pretty thin, and then just glued them onto the front, making sure they wouldn't stick out too far. A little tricky, but it looked good in the end. With that done, I went ahead and installed the side view mirrors and the door handles. With the interior complete and the cab nearly finished, I wanted to go ahead and get the cab installed on the chassis. I placed some glue around the perimeter of the interior, secured it in place with those magnets that I installed earlier, and then positioned the cab on top, trying to line it up the best I can with the front fenders before letting that glue dry. As that glue was drying, I continued by adding some additional details, painting and weathering where necessary, and frequently referencing the instructions included in the model kit to ensure I'm not forgetting anything. Once that glue had finally set, I removed the cab and did some simple weathering on the chassis, just using some more cheap pastels, rubbing it in with my finger, and then going over it with a brush. Again, some really basic stuff here, no fancy products or techniques. The trails will help add some additional weathering later on. It didn't take much to improve the appearance of the chassis, and it's a fun process too. As I continued with the assembly of the cab, I noticed that this tube here was really in the way of the fold-up fenders, so I just hacked away at it with not much concern for real-world accuracy here, but hey, at least there's enough clearance now. Alright, before committing to getting those fenders permanently attached to the front of the chassis, I should probably tackle my favorite part of these projects, which is dealing with the LEDs. As you can see, I'll need to do a little bit of soldering, and although I can go up to 12 volts with these LEDs, rather than running them straight off of the 3S LiPo battery, I'll have them a little dimmer by running them off of the receiver. Obviously, there's 4 LEDs in total, 2 warm white for the front and 2 red for the rear. Just a simple headlight and taillight arrangement, no functional brake lights or anything like that. When they're plugged in, everything's on. These came pre-wired, however in the front, those wires are thick enough to where it was causing some issues with being able to close the fenders all the way, and they kind of get in the way of the detailed engine compartment, so I just decided to swap those wires out with some tiny magnet wire. A little bit of extra hassle, but it was the right decision in the end. I did the best I could to get those wires tucked out of the way, and as you can see, everything is lighting up just like it should. It takes some effort, but it is a really nice look on the finished truck. I quickly designed and 3D printed a couple of housings for the taillights. Like you'd expect on a real truck like this, nothing fancy here, and later I just secured them to the underside of this piece on the chassis with some glue. But before I go any further with the assembly of the truck, I wanted to go ahead and get the engine put together, painted, and secured in place. No surprise, the fitment of some of these parts wasn't great. However, it's not like it's really a big deal if this engine piece isn't perfect. A lot of chrome on these parts, but I ended up just blasting it with a few layers of paint and then grimed it up with a black wash. As you can see, I had to cut away these lower portions of the engine in order to make it fit around the steering servo and the chassis, but it's not really noticeable once this engine is dropped into place. I wasn't really a huge fan of this gold color. I didn't see a ton of pictures online, but apparently these Mack engines were originally painted a gold color, but I think a gold with a bit more yellow would have looked better, but it is what it is. I applied a black wash to some additional sections on the chassis and the cab before getting this engine installed using some double-sided tape. I then hand-painted a few sections on the chassis that needed it, particularly the wires, to make sure that they blend in with the rest of the truck. A little final detail painting and installing some of these tiny parts that go on the hood was all that was left. Just like with the Mack lettering above the grille, I sanded down those Mack emblems that go on each half of the hood to try and make them look a little more scale. It's quite tedious to do, but I think they definitely look much better being thinner. But with those final tiny pieces in place, this Mack is now complete and ready to hit the trails. After the hours of work, this Mack is now finally complete, and I could take some time to admire this finished vehicle. In particular, I'm really happy with the color choice and the weathering, especially when considering the minimal skill and effort that was required. I wanted it to be relatively subtle and not make this truck look totally derelict and like it's ready for the scrapyard, instead just kind of look used and a bit rough, if that makes sense. I'd rather lean more on the side of making things look less weathered and maybe a bit too shiny relative to what I was picturing in my head, rather than going too far and having this thing look like it was dredged up from the bottom of the ocean. Along with collecting some reference images to help get some inspiration, I really tried to focus on not making the weathering look too uniform or consistent. In my opinion, it just doesn't look as good to sand everything the same amount, even if it can be easy to do if you're not thinking about it. There were a few areas that I kind of messed up a bit, but again, that's kind of the beauty of a patina build, is that you can just come in with paint or whatever else you have and make it look alright. Doesn't need to be perfect, in fact it's not supposed to look perfect. Obviously I didn't go as far as to make any body damage or rust or dents or anything like that. Just a few different layers of paint, a little sanding, a little bit of black wash and some pastels, and I'll let the trails do the rest. Also really happy with how the 3D printed wheels and cab guard turned out. Especially with the wheels when I saw them come off the 3D printer, naturally there was some texturing and imperfections as a result of the 3D printing process. I could have SLA 3D printed them in much higher detail with resin, but you know what, a little bit of primer, paint, and rubbing in some brown color from a pastel really makes them look good on this finished truck. I'm super happy with how these turned out. Like I said, the design with some of these wheels is a little bit of a compromise when compared to the appearance of the real thing, but when you get them printed, painted, and put together with a project, it's really not a big deal unless you want to micro-analyze every little detail, which in my opinion just starts to get to the point of making these projects no longer fun. But mad respect to all the hobbyists who do go to the absolute furthest point when it comes to detail and dimensional accuracy. Speaking of parts that might not be entirely accurate but still look good, that cab guard / storage compartment behind the cab turned out to be a pretty necessary add-on in order to not only provide a space for the battery, but also allow it to be easily changed without needing to touch the cab, as it really wouldn't be as convenient to have the battery in a spot that requires the cab to be removed every time I wanted to change it. Without a doubt, this setup here is far better, and I'm really happy I made the decision to add it on. If you wanted to do a similar build with a day cab but didn't want to have a storage compartment like this, you're probably either going to need to use smaller size electronics or sacrifice any engine detail to have room up front to put the electronics. That actually would be a pretty nice setup, but of course you just won't have any engine bay detail. The engine detail and fitment here is obviously nothing amazing, but I think in an RC vehicle like this, anything is better than nothing. Next time, maybe going with a little more hand-painted detail will help improve the appearance. I am really happy with how the lights turned out on this build. Having to deal with wires and making sure they're as out of sight as possible is not ideal, but the lights are subtle enough to where I think they add to the look of the truck without being too bright and kind of giving away the illusion. It turns out a solder joint on one of the headlights must be not that good, because sometimes when the truck is driving over a bump or gets rattled around, the light kind of flickers and turns off temporarily. But you know what, that's just one of those things I probably couldn't have done even if I intended to, so I'm calling that a feature that adds to the older, weathered state of this truck, one of the headlights being a little sketchy. Of course, like I've said many times before on this channel, a vehicle from this era having the dimmer, warmer glow LEDs for the headlights really looks so much better than just having that stark whitish, bluish LED glow. This here looks way better in my opinion. I could brighten them up if I ran them directly off of the battery at around 11 to 12 volts, but here I'm powering them off of the roughly 5 to 6 volt receiver, which I prefer. Maybe one of these days I'll get really crazy with the cab lights and the side marker lights and just go all out. That would look awesome, but I'm just going to stick with the headlights and tail lights here with this project. Back on the topic of things rattling around though, I do see the openable hood and fenders kind of bouncing around a bit when going over some of these bumps, which isn't exactly the best look. A few magnets could probably help keep things a bit more secure, but at the same time, I'm not sure it's really a huge deal, all things considered. As far as a few things I'm not super happy with how they turned out, the front fender alignment, particularly on the passenger side, is not great. As you can see, it's hanging a bit low there in the front. Like I said, I spent quite a bit of time trying to get the fitment of all these parts up front to line up as best as possible, but it's not quite as close as I would have liked it to be. It is like a 50-something-year-old truck that obviously has some miles on it, so it's not like it totally ruins the look, but a little more gap there than I would consider ideal. I have seen some very skilled model builders put this kit together and get everything lined up looking great, so it's certainly possible, but I missed the mark just a little bit here. That said, sifting through some real-world pictures online, I did find a few examples of some of these trucks having pretty bad fender alignment, so I felt a little bit better about myself after seeing those, but yeah, definitely not quite up to factory spec here. Although, as you can see, I did get all of these parts to fold away like they're supposed to, so you can get a good look at that engine, so at least from a functionality perspective, I nailed that part. And then another thing I noticed is that because the cab sits somewhat high off the frame, at certain angles you can kind of see through the truck underneath the cab right here. This is something I could fix relatively easily, probably just by placing some scrap pieces of plastic in spots underneath the cab, so you can't just see through the whole truck looking at it from certain angles. It seems like this is a larger gap than what you would tend to see on a lot of real trucks, so just blocking that out would help sell the illusion a little better. Aside from those things though, I'm really happy with the appearance, but what about the driving? Well, I mean, it's a semi-truck tractor, not a basher or a race car. It is what it is. I definitely wanted to get this truck out onto these trails since I'm going for sort of a heavy haul, mild off-road theme. As you can see, I think we were able to match the environment to the truck very well. Most of the footage that you're seeing here has been slowed down just to make it look more like the real thing. Obviously, this truck isn't perfect as it doesn't weigh that much and has a very stiff suspension and hard tires. Anytime it comes across a rock or a stick, it really rattles around way more than what you would see from a real truck that weighs many tons. Now, the CTC01 chassis isn't really designed for off-road driving over rougher terrain. However, I am curious to see how soft I can make the suspension on this Mack. I think that can make for kind of a cool challenge and video. Well, at least for me and maybe like 20 other people. Now, the front end would be very easy by installing some lighter coil springs and thinner leaf springs. Of course, thinner 3D printed leaf springs would be more prone to damage and sagging, but for just getting this truck to flex, that would be pretty easy. Now, with the rear suspension, motor mount, and axle situation we have here, getting this to flex I think would be more of a challenge, but I can see what I can do without totally redesigning everything in the rear. If I do ever design a more scale-accurate chassis, there is going to be more of an opportunity to have suspension flex, with the axles being able to move more independently of each other, but even with the CTC01 chassis as it stands currently, I do feel there's some room for improvement. It's not going to be a crawler by any means, but I'd be curious to see how much better I can make the suspension before having to totally redesign stuff and go down that rabbit hole. In addition to the suspension, it would be nice if those tires were a lot softer too, but I'm not sure if there's any soft compound RC tires available in this size. That would really help if such a thing existed, but of course they have to look the part too. I don't want to just put any old micro crawler tires like you would install on your SCX24 unless they have a similar appearance to these semi-truck tires. Now, as will be the case with any CTC01 truck build, while these particular motor and gear assemblies are great when it comes to durability, low cost, and ease of assembly, one not so desirable aspect of the worm gear design is that they pretty much lock up immediately when you let off the throttle. It's sort of like having the drag brake on full in a crawler. Now, naturally, when you're driving something like a super scale trail truck with a strong drag brake, you tend to learn to ease off the throttle when you want to come to a stop, rather than just abruptly taking your finger off the throttle trigger, letting it snap back to neutral, and as a result, abruptly locking up the drivetrain, basically simulating a panic stop. I know it's not exactly ideal here with the CTC01 to have the motor stop abruptly when you're trying to cruise around at a slow speed. Something that I like to do that you might consider trying is, if you want to drive at slow speeds without the motor accidentally locking up, is to adjust the throttle trim until power is being applied to the motor even when the throttle is in neutral. That way, even when you let off the throttle, it's not abruptly slamming to a stop. If you do want to stop, just move the throttle trigger slightly in the reverse direction, or move the throttle trim back towards the reverse direction. If you have a fancy enough transmitter, you can probably program it to do this by flipping a switch or pressing a button, rather than having to manually adjust the throttle trim back and forth, but of course either way works. This is just a very, very simple, very low-tech solution that you might prefer when driving one of these trucks. With this setup, it's more like driving a car with an automatic transmission, to where it'll roll when you let off the brakes rather than remain stationary. Just an idea for any of you out there who find the start-stop motion from the motors at low speeds annoying. Currently, this has been my preferred method of driving these trucks, and I recommend giving it a try. But as long as you're not expecting breakneck speeds, I think these trucks are a lot of fun to cruise around, either indoors or outside. It's very satisfying seeing one of these plastic models come to life, and this Mack is certainly no exception. Another nice rig to add to the collection, and I'm sure there will be many more to follow. As many of you predicted, I'm really getting into this niche of the RC hobby and having a lot of fun with it. Like I've said before, these larger commercial truck plastic model kits are a great subject for an RC conversion like this. It's not like you need the finished product to be extremely fast or capable of doing basher-like stunts. Also, you got a lot more room in these vehicles to fit all of the electronics. Of course, there's a huge variety of different model kits to choose from, all being relatively similar in width, since there's not nearly as much variation with these semi-trucks as there are with cars, where the size from one vehicle to another can vary more dramatically in both wheelbase and width. Of course, there are many more variations of these trucks that can be explored in the future, such as having a chassis with 3 axles or only a single axle in the rear. For now though, with the motor on axle design of the CTC01, obviously adjusting the wheelbase is very easy. Once you get everything painted and combine it with a highly detailed model kit, it really does look the part from almost any angle. The mechanical aspects of this chassis are quite easy to assemble and get working, so after that it's up to you as a model builder to make your rig look as lifelike as possible. As far as what's next for this Mack, as I mentioned in the prior segment, I would like to tinker with this chassis a bit more to get the suspension loosened up and see if it'll handle the bumps on these dirt roads a little more like the real thing. Basically make this truck look more like it weighs many tons rather than just several ounces. And of course, I would like to build a nice trailer to go along with it. That Fruhoff drive van that I built previously is fully compatible with this DM800 tractor, but it's not really on theme for this more rugged heavy haul Mack. I'm not exactly sure what kind of trailer I'll end up going with, but I'll figure out something that'll look cool. Feel free to leave your ideas below in the comments. Of course, it can't be too heavy, as keep in mind these plastic model to RC conversions aren't exactly designed to haul a ton of weight. They're more about simply looking the part rather than actually hauling some serious payload. I'm thinking some sort of logging trailer would be cool, but I'll have to be careful to keep the weight down. It obviously would be very easy to use real sticks to replicate logs, but I can't have them be too heavy. What I could probably do is create a cylindrical core out of something lightweight like styrofoam, and then just glue sticks to the outside as sort of a veneer to cover the foam and make it look like it's hauling a big load of logs while keeping things nice and light. Something that I've been thinking about, but whatever I end up doing, I'll be sure to cover it in a future video. As for today's video though, I certainly hope you all enjoyed watching this rig come to life, and this video is helpful to any hobbyists out there looking to build something similar. Again, huge thanks for all of the support and interest in the CTC01 platform. I hope you enjoy these new part designs, and please feel free to let us know any ideas you have that you'd like to see in future updates. But with all that said, I'm going to wrap up today's video right here. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.